I'm now going to go to James Marlow, who specialises actually in the Middle East and who has an authoritative line on the situation that's evolving in Israel, and I guess also with the United Nations as a whole, how much faith we have in the United Nations. James, over to you.
Hello, Katie. Good afternoon.
Oh, afternoon. I keep saying morning. I'm so sorry. Good afternoon. James, what do you think in terms of, if we go broader to start with, the United Nations and its role?
Well, let me tell you a couple of things just in 2016 alone.
Sure.
Here's one. In June of this year, Saudi Arabia was so incensed that their name was mentioned in a United Nations report, which was entitled Children Killed in Armed Conflict, that they threatened to cut their UN funding. Now, what happened was a Saudi minister telephoned Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and said, if you do not remove our name from this report, which says that Saudi bombed some 520 children in Yemen, we will cut all our funding to major UN agencies. And also that included UNRWA, which is the agency responsible for the protection of Palestinian refugees.
Yes.
Other Arab states also went further. They also called up Ban Ki-moon and they threatened a fatwa. A fatwa is an Islamic religious decree, and it said again that if you do not remove the Saudi name from this report, then we will issue a fatwa that says that the UN is anti-Islamic. So Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, he was forced to stand before the media, and he said he was coming under enormous pressure and that he had no other choice but to delete the Saudi name from the report because his number one objective, and these are his words, was to save UN agencies. And besides the Secretary General's statement and various other announcements from UN agencies, the agency of Reuters also reported on this. And we were referring to, of course, as around 10,000 civilians estimated to have been killed so far in the Saudi air bombardment in the current Yemen war. So it's not really surprising that Ban Ki-moon acts with selected concern for human rights. But of course, in doing so, you actually harm the very meaning and idea of what human rights actually stands for.
Do you feel that, James, do you feel that there is a sense that the UN really is open to the biggest bidder?
Absolutely. The United Nations is represented by 193 nations. Now, believe it or not, more than 2/3 of those nations are today run by dictatorships, and some of them are very brutal dictators. That, of course, includes, out of those 193 nations, 22 of them are Arab states. Altogether, there's 56 Islamic states. And when resolutions go against Israel, it's not very difficult to work out the math, because you have always those 56 Islamic states voting against Israel. But at the same time, you also have a number of other nations around the world, like in South America, like in Africa, like in Asia, that always has to vote with the Islamic countries for economic reasons, for political reasons, for business reasons. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, it's slightly terrifying, James, when you hear somebody like yourself, who's an expert in this area, pointing out statistically, mathematically, I guess from a doctrine perspective, Islamic kind of doctrine, people voting according to a faith, and then people voting because they want to be seen on the side of the Islamic nations. It's slightly terrifying that could be the case, and that's what we call the United Nations. That's what we call a governing body supposed to represent us all. And I suppose Israel, with it's talking about withdrawing its funding, but Israel only gives 0.5% of the UN's total budget, so presumably has hardly any voice anyway.
Yeah, that's true. And there's a report which has been instituted by Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday, and it will take a month for it to come out, just to look at how much money is actually going from Israel to the United Nations. But you're right, it's a very small amount. What they're talking about in the Trump camp is actually to look at the funding that the United States invests and keeps up and bucks up the United Nations. And I think you mentioned earlier on, how long were the United Nations likely to go on? I mean, I wouldn't like to answer that question, but it's all based on how much funding it gets.
Yes.
As we saw from the example of Ban Ki-moon. I mean, if we're talking about Israel, not once has any one of Ban Ki-moon's 90 or so op-eds in newspapers and magazines in the past 10 years ever gone after a specific country like it's done with Israel. Not China, not Russia, not Cuba, Iran, Saudi Arabia, North Korea. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But he went as far as, and again, it's all about politics.
Yeah, and James, in terms of when we think about this now, we have Trump coming into power and the amount of budget spent. So the USA, of course, the number one contributor by quite some margin to the UN. Presumably, therefore, a level of influence he will be able to assert even over the kind of Islamic Brotherhood of Nations will be quite strong.
One would think so. I mean, I should imagine that he's coming into a massive load of problems on his desk. So it's a big question as to what he's going to look at first. I should imagine he's going to look at home affairs and leave foreign affairs for another session. And I wouldn't know where he would start on that. Of course, United States has an extremely bad reputation around the world because it decided under Obama to pull out and, in effect, just not have any influence on the world. And Russia took advantage of that. I think that's actually what Trump means when he said he admires Putin. Not that he's best friends with him, not he admires the fact that it's not such a democracy in Russia, or that he has clamped down very much on any opposition in Russia. He admires, Trump is a businessman, and Trump admires other businessmen. He respects really successful, big business people. And therefore, Putin saw the opportunity to take advantage of the fact that the Americans decided to just disappear. And Putin saw, you know what, I've got an opportunity to influence Russia and to look after my bases in Latakia, which is part of the northern eastern side of Syria, to send in troops, to send in a massive amount of armory. And I'm going to hang on to that, and I'm going to back up Assad, and I'm going to have power in the Middle East. And I think that's why Trump says, I admire Putin, because he admires somebody as a business person. I don't think he's ever met him in person. Of course, they've spoken on the telephone since being elected.
And they wrote, I think Putin wrote him a letter for Christmas saying that they could be busy mates. Nice. So I'm quite excited about that too. James, now, just finally, thank you so much for all your thoughts there on the United Nations, and in particular with its relationship with Israel, and explaining why some of the politicking that goes on behind this is as it is. I believe, and on this day where we're learning about the sad news about George Michael, I think you may have met him once.
Oh, you heard?
I heard. Nothing is safe from my little ears, James.
Let me just swap over my hat then in that case.
Yes, change hats, change voice, and go.
Many years ago, when I left school, actually, I ended up being a tea boy in one of the leading recording studios in this country. Very simply making teas for a lot of very well-known bands at the time. It's one of the very big recording studios in this country. And so I moved up what they call from a tea boy to a tape operator in those days, to an assistant sound engineer, to a sound engineer. And then a few years later, I moved on to Psalm West recording studios. Psalm West is where they did the single "Do They Know It's Christmas" in 1984. So there was a number of bands that used to come in there, like Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and so many bands. They all escape me right now. But I remember working with George Michael in the early part of 1985. A very quiet chap, very talented chap, came in, and we put down some tracks, 4 or 5 of them. And again, I remarked to some of my colleagues afterwards that this man is quite extraordinary, because you normally have a songwriter and maybe a singer, but George Michael did it all. And this was back in 1985, so I don't think he'd reached his peak at that point as well in terms of songs and what he produced. But he arranged the songs. He was a musician, not a magician, he was a musician, actually.
Easy to confuse.
Maybe they are very similar. He produced everything. He had a great voice, just a remarkable person, so talented.
Oh, James, thank you. Thank you for giving up so much of your time on this Boxing Day. I really appreciate it, and for giving such informative views and insight really into the way the workings, the inner and mysterious workings at the UN. So do give me a call about the United Nations. I'm looking for someone to give me the positive reason why the UN is great. Equally, if you would like to explain to me exactly why Israeli settlements have no validity and do breach international law, perhaps you're very pro-Palestine Palestine and want to correct my views, do call 03456060973. I'm Katie Hopkins. This is LBC, and the time is now 12:49.